Today we're going to take a look at what occurred right after the Battle of Saratoga, or within months, and that was the move into winter quarters, which may not sound actually that exciting. But what happened in December of 1777, just days before Christmas, was that Continental Army, led by Washington, was taken into winter quarters at a famous place known as Valley Forge, not far outside the city of Philadelphia, where one of his primary enemies at this time, General Howe, had set up his own winter quarters. Now, winter quarters are something that we're not as familiar with in modern times, but winter quarters were common prior to the modern era for any form of warfare. In other words, during winter, because there's less growing, because there's less to feed your army, because you have to deal with things like snow and ice, it's much easier if you just camp somewhere or stay put instead of going to war. Traditionally, armies waited until the spring, specifically the month of March, which is named after Mars, the god of war, in order to actually go out to fight because the weather would actually suit their purposes much better. So Washington took his men into winter quarters, and that itself isn't very exciting. But what's intriguing about that is that when he did this, his men were badly beaten up. Not so much in the sense of losing engagements, but in the sense that they didn't have basic things like proper shelter through tents, or proper coats for the coming winter, or blankets, or for that matter, in many cases, even shoes. In fact, the story is told that as they went into winter quarters, the snow had already fallen, and many of the men who had no feet, and I'm sorry, they had feet, don't worry about that, who had no shoes and no socks, their feet actually bled and left behind trails of blood in the snow. It's kind of similar to those who hunt in the winter. If you wound the animal you're hunting, such as a deer, you sometimes follow the blood trail to actually find them. The British also could have followed this blood trail, but they had no need. They knew where Washington and his army was. And they knew that there in Valley Forge, they were badly beaten and badly battered as well. To make matters worse, not only did they not have proper shelter or proper clothing or proper shoes and footgear, they also had very little food. In fact, Thanksgiving of that year was not exactly an upbeat affair. Most of the men that year for Thanksgiving were given a cup of rice and a tablespoon of vinegar to give it some flavor, and that was their Thanksgiving feast. And somewhat similar to what the Pilgrims faced when they first came over here. And so critics at this time in the army, or critics who had once been those sunshine patriots, as Thomas Paine famously called them, were the people who could just say, look, we had things better off when we were with the British. Why have you taken us out into the wilderness to die? Kind of like the Israelites said to Moses after they left Egypt. Well, General Howe, who was back in Philadelphia doing things like having great feast, housing great balls, having parades, and known for his charity to the poor, learned of how badly off the Americans were, and he wanted to attack. There was just one problem. Valley Forge is very easy to defend, and he knew that even with a huge force, if he attacked Valley Forge, he would have to actually sacrifice much of his army to take it over. And so he knew that the only way to take it, at least take it well, was by a secret attack, some kind of surprise. And so he began to plan with his generals when they would strike and how they would strike. One of these commanding officers, who was in on the planning process, was staying in Philadelphia at a home known or owned by the Darrah family. The Darrah family probably went along with the whole British occupation, and the husband was probably a loyalist, but his wife, Lydia, was not. Lydia, famously knowing that the British were up to something and that what they were up to might finally defeat the American army, famously went to bed early one night when she knew they were going to be meeting at her house. She made sure that she looked like she was sleeping. When the British commander was so daring, he actually opened the door of her bedroom to make sure she was asleep. She then waited for him to close the door. He went into the other room to begin having the meeting with other British officers. She snuck out and, famously in her silk stockings, crept to the door where they were meeting, and there she heard their entire plan to attack Valley Forge. The following day, she told the British sentries who were posted at the exit to Philadelphia that she had to leave town on an errand, They, thinking that she was a loyalist to the British cause, let her go. She then found some messengers to actually carry the message to Washington that he was about to be attacked. So when Howe and his men came to Valley Forge, they suddenly saw that the American army was ready for them, and Howe knew the game was up. He couldn't actually have that secret surprise attack he had planned on, and so he retreated. But all of this was seen as an incredible need for survival. The American army was hanging on by a thread. They were practically starving. It was during these winters at Valley Forge, because they would spend more than one there, it was during these seasons that Washington would stay with his men. He would share the cold with them, he would share the hunger with them, he would share all of their loneliness, because they were far from their families often, because he also was far from home as well. Washington earned their respect that way. But just earning their respect and just sharing those kind of experiences was not enough to survive. That's where we enter the character of Baron von Steuben, who's kind of like a Miles Standish or a John Smith, because Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian commander, was brought in specifically to drill and to train the American soldiers to be the finest soldiers that they could possibly be. In other words, he understood Proverbs 24:9 very well, that if you faint in the day of adversity, then your strength is small. He knew that it was a sure thing that they would be going to battle again. He knew that they were going to have a day of adversity once again. And so they had to be able to stand up and not faint, which means they needed increased strength. It was Baron von Steuben's training in many ways that saved the army and was able to keep them going. Now, the second tale that we'll talk about today is the character Benedict Arnold, that great hero from Saratoga, who had also distinguished himself at several other battles. See, what happened with Benedict Arnold is very key to the whole story of the War of Independence. And it begins with his discontentment. See, Arnold, who was seen as a hero by many, was passed over for promotion several times. He never achieved the command that he thought he deserved, especially when he was dealing with inept commanders, men like Horatio Gates. He also often received little credit for the heroic things that he had done in the battle itself. And so he let that fester. He let that inside him actually eat him up. It ate him up so much that he continued to go downward. In the year 1780, something happened to him that caused him to see himself entirely as a victim. It was in that year, for example, that he was court-martialed on charges of bribery and extortion. He was accused of stealing money from the Continental Army and the Continental Congress. Now, the charges were false. They were brought against him because he had enemies in the Continental Army who wanted to get rid of him. The charges were eventually seen as false. He was completely acquitted, but it left him bitter. It left him angry. And like I said, he saw himself as a victim. And when you or I see ourselves as victims, we tend to make poor choices. We tend to think that the world owes us something, and Arnold began to think that the world did indeed owe him something. He decided that the American army and the American cause of liberty was not going to pay. And so he sold himself to the British for £26,000, as well as a commission to become a brigadier general in their army. Now, this price didn't come easily. Not only was Arnold going to join the British, but he was going to surrender the fortress that he was in charge of, a place known famously as West Point, which is on the Hudson River. And West Point is kind of the key position on the Hudson River. If you control that outlet of land, then you really control the passage of the entire river, which controls the splitting of the entire colonies. And so this was a key moment. He was about to surrender it to them, about to actually have them march in, when his plan was found out and Arnold barely escaped with his life. He made it to the British, who did indeed make him a general, but because he had already betrayed his people, the British didn't trust him. They saw him as a traitor, and so therefore they put him in charge of attacking civilians, of attacking towns, which they knew would make him a stink completely in the eyes of all the American colonists and the patriots. As a result, he did indeed become a stink. He was despised. When the war ended and he failed to help Britain win it, he moved to London and lived out his days an unhappy, broken man. The one redeeming fact about Benedict Arnold is probably what happened at his death. Again, it's one of those stories in history where we're not entirely certain if it happened this way. But I'll tell you the story the way that I hope it happened, and that is this. They say that on his deathbed, he asked forgiveness for his sins of betrayal. They also say that upon his deathbed, he requested that he be buried not in the uniform of Britain, but in the uniform of the American Continental Army. He asked that because he said that was the uniform he wore when he had done honorable and sacred deeds. So Arnold, as great as a traitor as he was, also may have been an incredible character, especially with such a deathbed forgiveness as that.